Well, thank you so much. It is a great delight to be here. It is a special privilege whenever we have the opportunity to be in the presence of thinking Christians. And where Ligonier is found, thinking Christians are to be found. And I'm glad to have the honor of thinking with you today. The topic, the disappearance of God, is a bit dangerous in terms of public relations. Publishing a book by that title is a little bit dangerous when people write you without having read your book to say, God has not disappeared. How dare you write a book suggesting that God has disappeared? Here's good news, God has not disappeared. Well, I bring you an emphatic word that God has not disappeared. But the knowledge and consciousness of God has disappeared from many of our neighbors and their lives and from the consciousness of the society around us. Being Christian in a post-Christian culture is no easy task. That's why we're gathering together here in a conference, and we will not settle all the issues nor even be able to raise and consider all the questions that would be derivative of a title like that. We desperately want to know what it means to be a Christian, and by that we mean a faithful Christian in a post-Christian culture. But the definition of terms is always important. We're talking about culture. We're modifying it by saying it's a post-Christian culture, and yet there are those who would hear us say this and wonder if we have any touch with reality whatsoever. Ardent secularists are fairly certain that this is not a post-Christian culture. You can find certain enclaves within the larger North American culture where it might not appear that this is a post-Christian culture. But if one has discernment and eyes to see the direction of the culture and where the culture is represented by its leading edge, it is by any Christian definition a post-Christian culture. For many in this current generation of Christians now living, this is a question that is interesting but not urgent. There are many who are living in a situation within the larger culture in which this is not really what is pressing upon you in terms of your everyday life. But if you are, for instance, a young American between the ages, say, of 18 and 30, this is the world you, by definition, know. This is the normal that generation now just takes for granted. If you are situated on one of America's college or university campuses, this is a world that you have seen coming for some time. If you live amongst those defined as the cultural creatives in America, if you live geographically in the Northwest or in the Northeast, or even more generalized on the East Coast or on the West Coast, you're more likely to see what we mean when we refer to a post-Christian culture. April the 4th, 2009, Newsweek magazine had a cover story, The End of Christian America. John Meacham, writing that article, began the article with a conversation he recalled with me. And he refers to a statement that I had made about how America has changed. I spoke of the Judeo-Christian consensus of the last millennium giving way to a postmodern, post-Christian, post-Western cultural reality. It's a cultural crisis that threatens the very heart of the culture that we know. I spoke about a new post-Christian narrative controlling the worldview and shaping the passions and directing the intuitions of an increasing number of Americans. Now, what led Newsweek into an intensive interest in that particular question is the statistical analysis. And journalists in particular are driven by these kinds of statistical analyses because they pop up with regularity, about 3 or 4 a year, from major research centers and polling institutes. And they indicate something of the shift in worldview. They put numbers to what we perceive in a more relational sense. And the numbers are very striking. In the American Religious Identification Survey, and by the way, some of these are not so authoritative, but some of them are. ARIS is very authoritative. The stuff you see from the Pew Center, that's very authoritative. The stuff from the NORC data coming out of the University of Chicago, very authoritative. These are not just pollsters that primarily do marketing and every once in a while ask some theological questions. These are major centers of research in terms of the religious life of America. The American Religious Identification Survey is a straightforward kind of survey. It asks the question, who are you? How do you identify yourselves? So it's not asking primarily questions of belief. If you say you're a Baptist, it's not going to interrogate you if you actually are a Baptist, because it's not interested in whether you're actually well-grounded and catechized. It's interested in who you think you are. Now, that's a very interesting question. Who are you? Well, in the American Religious Identification Survey, between the years of 1990 and the year 2000, and then fast forward into the mid part of this decade, the number of Americans identified as Christian in the larger population reduced by 10%. That's about a 15-year period in which the number of Americans, the percentage of Americans who identified themselves as Christian dropped by 10%. Folks, in the world of demographics and statistics concerning populations, that's massive. It's almost breathtaking. You have to wonder if the statistics could be real. Now again, we're not talking about the number of believing Christians in America. That's a different question. We're asking Americans, how many of you identify as Christians? It had been 86% in 1990, but it is only 76% by the time you reach 2009. That period of change, that scale of unprecedented change caught the attention of Newsweek magazine and led to a front page story. Now, when you look at a statistic like that, you want to know, well, is that an anomaly? Does that just come out of the blue? Is it connected to anything else? And well, it is. Survey after survey is indicating that the number of persons who identify as atheists or agnostics is growing roughly at the same percentage and according to the same kind of scale as those who are now not identifying themselves as Christians. Now that too is interesting because for the first time in American history, we have a shift not from one religious faith to another in terms of a major kind of statistical change. We have a change from Christian to atheist. Well, there's more than that. There are the nones, which has led to no shortage of confusion in the media. I did an interview with National Public Radio for which the mail was more fascinating than anything I have ever seen in my life in terms of my engagement in the media. No appearance on Larry King, no O'Reilly Factor, no ABC, World News Tonight has met the kind of mail I got when people thought we were talking about a radical increase in the number of nuns. And they were wondering why National Public Radio would have on the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary to talk about why there was such a radical increase in the number of nuns. They were thinking Catholic ladies in habits. These are N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. These are Americans who say none of the above. When asked to identify themselves, it's none of the above. They are the new nuns. Now, I am corrected by misunderstanding in the media, the people who thought I was talking about Roman Catholic female orders. In case there's any lack of clarification there, those numbers are diminishing. But the number of those who are among us who say simply none of the above is growing fast. It's the fastest growing component in terms of American religious self-identification. Now, the controversy that came to the Newsweek magazine is itself very interesting. And it's interesting because it came from multiple directions. There were secularists who saw this article, cover story, Newsweek magazine, the end of Christian America, and they went right back to the mid-1960s when Time magazine had a famous cover story declaring that God is dead, with the rise of the death of God theology. And their argument is, well, it so happens that the vast mainstream of American culture doesn't know that God is dead. And Christian America is defined by the fact that there are still many, many active, believing, participating, church-going believers in America. Well, that indicates that Newsweek's cover story was somewhat overblown. But to read the news story, to read the magazine's account, John Meacham's essay, was to note that's actually not what he's discussing. But I was more troubled by the response from many within the church, from many conservative Christians who wrote and said, Newsweek simply wrong. This is another Time magazine cover story from the 1960s. This is secular Newsweek attempting to dance upon the grave of Christianity. That's not what it was about either. Far too many conservative Christians were writing in to say, if this is true, then people are going to begin to, diminish our political influence, as if that should be the issue. No, the end of Christian America has to do with the fact that the Christian worldview is no longer the standard frame of intellectual reference for many, many Americans, for the fastest growing number of Americans. And even more than that, specifically, it is now the new normal for Americans in certain social placement. And that's the problem. Many of the people who argued against the Newsweek cover story, either from what you might call the more secular or the more Christian direction, failed to understand that there are very important differences in terms of the social context in which we find ourselves. It may be that if you are in small-town America, it doesn't look like post-Christian America yet. But small-town America is not the future of America. And that is not where the culture is primarily being shaped. That is not where the movies are being made. That's not where the books are being published. That's not where the vast majority of young people are being educated. John Meacham, in writing that essay on the end of Christian America, very quickly picked up on a comment that I had made to him in analyzing this data. Fascinating conversation. I pointed out that to anyone with an historical perspective, the one thing this data presented that was a tragic surprise is that for the first time in the year 2009, the data indicated that the most secular region of America is now the Northeast rather than the Northwest. Now, we have to rewind a little historical consciousness in order to understand what that's all about and why it would trouble a Christian theologian. The Northwest has been for its almost entire existence as a part of the American experience the most secular part of this country. It was the least evangelized. There was no massive, considerable evangelical witness there before the population began to arrive, as was true on the West Coast. Just in terms of the statistics, the least churched area in American history, insofar as Oregon and Washington State, for instance, and Northern California have been included in this experiment, that they have been the least churched portion of America. They have been the most European part of America in terms of the statistics. But now that has changed. It's now the Northeast. The Northeast is actually marginally now more secular than the Northwest. And what makes that particularly of note to us is that that was an evangelized area, just speaking in terms of historic Christian witness and the process of even the establishment and the colonization of the Northeast. That is where the American Republic was born. That is where our national consciousness was incubated. That is where the Christian worldview, the Christian passions and motivations that drew so many people to cross an ocean in order to establish colonies, that has now, as an area that had been the very bed of American self-consciousness, it is now the most secular portion of America, eclipsing even the Northwest. Now I have to backtrack a little bit here. Those who responded to that Newsweek magazine cover story out of their own passions and out of their own perspective, those who rejected it said, either it's saying too much or it's saying too little. But the reality is that what John Meacham was talking about in that article, even where I differ with his analysis of whether it's a good or a bad thing, is something that marks the culture around us to an extent that is absolutely undeniable. We are living in a very different culture than the culture into which most of us were born, regardless of how old we are in this room. That's a safe assumption to say. If that kind of change takes place just between the years 1990 and 2009, what kind of scale of change is represented by our lifetimes? And furthermore, by the lifetimes of our children and our grandchildren. We are now looking at an acceleration of social change and of spiritual and worldview transformation around us that should capture our attention. The background of this is, of course, modernity. This is a reality that has come into shape and into position precisely because of the challenge that comes to us by the Enlightenment, by the new understanding of the self that came with the Enlightenment, by the elevation of human reason, and that in particular an autonomous human reason, by the rise of modern science and other intellectual developments that produced this enormous challenge to the situated Christian worldview. You can't talk about this without tangibly pointing to what may be called the four horsemen of modernity: Marx, Darwin, Nietzsche, and Freud. It just so happens that you take those four figures and you have at least the major thrust of post-Enlightenment thinking and of the modernity coming to age of the modern worldview. You have Marx, who, of course, explicitly rejected the Christian worldview, rejected its notion of humanity, rejected its notion of the self, rejected its notion of sin, rejected its message of redemption, rejected its eschatology. And Marx, in his writings and in his movement, replaced every major Christian doctrine with a Marxist alternative. And it is an alternative that has had enormous resonance with people from the 19th century onward. It is very easy for us, as we meet together today, to think, well, then came 1989, then came the fall of the Soviet Union, then came the market-driven dynamic of communist China. Well, here's what you need to note. The intellectual shift of Marxism has not gone away. The intellectual change that came as Marxist doctrines were presented as an alternative to every major Christian doctrine, they are still well situated. They're well situated in the mind of Western Europe, especially in the elites. They are well situated in the intellectual life of America, especially on college and university campuses and in the intellectual elites. Then along comes Darwin. You cannot have the modern world without Darwin. As Richard Dawkins, of whom I will say more later, says that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Because the Darwinian worldview, and I'm not just speaking about the explicit writings and teachings and thought of Charles Darwin, but the Darwinian worldview that developed, like Marxism, provided an alternative to virtually every single Christian doctrine, every single Christian truth claim. A different notion of origins, a completely different definition of humanity. And by the way, it is becoming clearer and clearer that the chief intellectual thrusts of Darwinism in terms of its current representations is against any claim of special status for humanity or special meaning of humanity. Again, the whole dynamic of evolutionary progression, of the survival of the fittest, of natural selection, replaced providence, creation, Christian anthropology, sin, fall, redemption, and of course, eschatology. And also, the Darwinian revolution became the final cement of authorizing scientism as a worldview, in which there is the belief that ultimate liberation is going to come as it comes to humanity by the intellectual liberation that is brought about by autonomous science. And then comes Nietzsche. Nietzsche, who declares that there actually is no meaning, there is no truth, that all that remains after the ashes of modernity is power. There is no good, there is no evil. Seldom was there anyone who wrote with such a pen against Christianity as Nietzsche well understood that Christianity, the totality of the Christian truth claim, comprehensively and then in its individual parts, represents the essential challenge and alternative to modernity. Nietzsche thought that the modernists lacked heart. They lacked the conviction to press their own convictions to their logical conclusion. They lacked the courage of their own intellectual commitments. Nietzsche famously declared that God is dead and we have killed him. All that is left, according to Nietzsche's worldview, is power and the negotiations of power. It's a very interesting understanding when you actually unpack Nietzsche. Nietzsche came to believe that all claims to truth are disguised claims to power. And that so when anyone tries to establish something is true, what they're actually trying to do is to establish a framework that basically serves to reinforce their own power and to make their own power the only answer to the problem that their truth claim presents. So therefore, according to Nietzsche, when you say something is true, you're saying this is what must be true in order for me to protect my privileged position. And that worldview, ladies and gentlemen, is dominant on the American college and university campus. Except, of course, when it comes to their own claims to power and truth. After Nietzsche comes Freud. If we just had the three, this would be an incomplete project. But Nietzsche and Marx and Darwin only become fully authorized when joined by the fourth member of their quartet, which is Freud. Because Freud authorized what the other three never fully authorized. And that is the assumption that whatever problems we have are those that have been inflicted upon us, if not from some kind of identifiable force outside of us, then from a subconscious over which we have no utter control. And so Freud removes the human being not only from the biblical story of creation and fall and redemption and even from eschatology, but Freud removes the individual from moral accountability and makes of every single human being a victim. Freud completes the Copernican moral revolution such that at the end of the Freudian experiment, human beings are convinced that the problem is something outside of us and the answer is something inside of us, which is the exact opposite of the Christian understanding. The problem is something inside of us. The answer is only something outside of us. And if the answer to the problem is going to be inside of us, because the problem is something that happened of which we are victims, something that came from outside of us, even if it's now represented by something that's in our unconscious and subconscious of which we have no control, then you're going to have talk therapy, and you're going to have to try to have a therapeutic modality, a therapeutic approach, so that you eventually pull out from the individual the answer that is within her, the solution, the overcoming authorization that comes from within the individual. Philip Reeve, writing about a generation ago, said that the one thing Americans now know about themselves is that they are sick. That our self-consciousness is now reducible to the fact that all of us are sick. One of the most controversial issues in contemporary psychology and psychiatry is the revision of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the official list of official psychiatric and psychological diseases. It is one of the hottest controversies in academia and in medicine these days. And you know what the reason why? It's because everybody wants everything they might possibly imagine added as an authorized and official problem or illness to which their own therapy is the obvious only answer. But there's more to it than that. Every potential human problem is now being, by attempt, reducible to something that can be diagnosed and statistically analyzed as a medical problem. We're medicalizing everything. There was an article, and I hesitate to mention this in this context, except for the force of illustrative necessity. You're warned. This week, one of the debates in that field has to do with people who are involved in a current sexual perversion. And the debate is because you can't say that sexual perversion is a perversion. Because there's some people who might want to do that simply because they want to do that. There are other people who might want to do that because it's, according to their own worldview, something that is representative of an illness. Well, the problem is they can't agree what's the illness and what's not the illness. It's a political debate. Who in the world would believe that that's a serious scientific debate? Go back to Hawaii, approximately 20 years ago. On one day, the American Psychiatric Association said that homosexuality is a mental disease. They voted, and the next day said that it's normal. That is not science. But that is a symptom as well as an illustration of where we are. We medicalize everything, and then when we finally decide that it's no longer a problem, we demedicalize it and just declare it normal. How do we figure out all these things? What's the process whereby all this comes to pass? If you're talking about the disappearance of God, we have to use the word secularization. Now, in a minute, we're going to use the word secularism, but right now we're going to use the word secularization. And the word secularization, as it is employed in this context, simply means the transformation of a reality from one that had supernatural reference to one that does not. Now, it has to do with the claim of the city, and the city has been the basic locus where all of this transformation has taken place. You have not had villages secularizing cities. Instead, you've had cities secularizing villages. So, okay, you put all that together. You have the secular city. You have what had been a place where supernatural claims reigned, and now it's largely devoid, at least, of any binding supernatural reference. Now, how does that word apply to us and to our society? Well, if you go back to especially the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the leading intellectuals were absolutely convinced that there was an inevitable process of secularization that had begun and would continue to run and to reign. It would continue to dominate the culture and transform the culture until we eventually arrived at something that would be utterly secularized. Now, the way they were thinking is this. As human beings gain understanding by the process of their reason, as they gain knowledge by the employment of their science, as they split the atom, as they dam up great rivers, and as they discover that they can put a man on the moon and return him back safely, and as the world becomes more and more known and the other becomes less exotic, as things become. And by the way, the early idea of this was that there was pretty much a box, and the box had a divider in it between knowledge and ignorance. And they were pretty much convinced that human history means that the ignorance is giving way to knowledge. And eventually, as human knowledge and intellectual content and ability and cogitation arise, the room for the supernatural would disappear. Auguste Comte, the father of positivism, in the 19th century suggested that the rule of modernity would give way such that there would be absolutely no space for the supernatural whatsoever. He said all will be left was the science he called positivism. Emile Durkheim, the most influential sociologist of the 20th century, called this disenchantment. A world in which there is the supernatural is an enchanted world, whether it be a world of gnomes and witches or a world of the biblical God. God is no longer a necessary referent, he said. There are two great assumptions. Number one was the assumption that theism is an inherited belief that was one time necessary. There was a time when people needed to believe in God because there were things they didn't understand. There was a story they couldn't tell without reference to God. And so it was necessary. It's inherited. So fathers and mothers passed it on to their children. And it's, to use the language of Richard Dawkins again, it's a meme. It's an inherited idea. But the second assumption was that religious belief is primarily reducible to a social function. In other words, these thinkers were anti-supernaturalists themselves. They didn't believe that there is a God, so they assumed that religion is primarily a social function anyway. But religion is what makes people obey the king. Religion is what makes children obey their parents. It leads to social cohesion. But eventually, we won't need it anymore, and we will evolve socially to a point at which we do not need it. There's a shift, they suggested, from belief to unbelief. Now, this is interesting. It's not a shift primarily from belief to disbelief, but a shift to unbelief. Now, what's the difference between unbelief and disbelief? Well, disbelief would represent an explicit self-conscious rejection of a supernatural truth claim. But unbelief means merely a lack of commitment to the supernatural or the belief in the supernatural. It's much easier to shift to unbelief. And let's put it this way, far more people shift to unbelief than to active disbelief, which is no small frustration to the disbelievers. They believed this was inevitable. They believed that it would be absolutely pervasive through society. All sectors of life would give way. Work would be secularized. Time would be secularized. Space would be secularized. Public argument would be secularized. Public symbols would be secularized. Language would be secularized. Relationships, such as marriage, would be secularized. Here's the question. Did it happen? I mean, these prophets of secularization, were they right or were they wrong? The answer is yes. They weren't right the way they thought they were going to be right. They genuinely believed that this process of secularization, of pushing out the supernatural, would be pervasive through every part of society simultaneously, seamlessly. That did not happen. Well, let's put it this way. It didn't happen here. It sort of did happen in Europe. As a matter of fact, secularization theory pretty much explains Europe, Western Europe in particular. It explains France and the Netherlands, explains even to our utter surprise, at the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century, even historically Catholic nations such as Italy and Spain. It explains certainly much of what's going on now in the United Kingdom and in the parts of the world that are European without being in Europe, such as Canada, which is far more similar to Europe in terms of the secularization pattern than it is to its neighbor to the south. So geographically, there's an exception. Secularization is not even in terms of geography. In Western Europe, by the way, right now, in Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Spain, and France, approximately 1 to 5% of the population are churchgoers, defined by attending church even once a month. 1 to 5%. The kind of study that is here represented by the American Religious Identification Survey done in Europe indicates that less than 10% believe in God if God has any theistic definition. If we're talking about theism here, only about 10%, a little less than 10% say they believe in God. Now in the United States, there is the exception. It's the great issue that leads historians and demographers and sociologists and political scientists to endlessly debate. How do you explain American exceptionalism? How do you explain the fact that even when we were talking about that shift from 1990 to 2009, it was not a shift from 11% to 10%. It was a shift from 86% to 76%. 76% of Americans not only say that they are believers in God, but that they are Christians. Church-going rates in the United States are a quantum multiplier of what you find in Europe. More Americans tomorrow will attend church than will attend all professional sporting events put together. Whereas in Europe, it's the opposite to an extreme. So many evangelicals, the kind of evangelicals who responded to the Newsweek magazine cover story with apoplexy and anger, say, how can you call this a secularized country? It isn't secularized. Well, certainly it's not even. The secularization theory was not as seamless and as pervasive and universal as was claimed. But there are enclaves in the United States of America that are more European in terms of these patterns than they are like the heartland of the country. So, for instance, you take what we talked about with the Northeast and the Northwest, you put those together, and then you generalize it as the statistics indicate they ought to be generalized down the coast. So you go from Oregon and Washington down California all the way to Los Angeles and Hollywood, and you go all the way from New England down to Miami, and you'll discover that the closer you get to the coast, I say, so close to the Potomac, you find a radical increase in secularization. You find a radical decrease in the number of church-going people as compared with, say, what you would find in Iowa or in Kentucky or in Alabama or in Texas. So there is a geographic anomaly here. It isn't even geographically, but it turns out it's even more uneven socially. Now, if you go to Europe, again, the secularization theory appeared to work rather seamlessly. It is not the case in Europe that a dairy farmer is likely to be significantly less secularized than a philosophy professor. But in the United States, it's a radical distinction. The most secularized cohort in America is the American professoriate, the faculty of our universities. They are the most secularized cohort in America. The American college and university campus is the most secularized space in this nation. Second only to the universities are the enclaves of the cultural creatives, where the culture is shaped in terms of its entertainment, its media. And so if you go to New York, in the literary circles and in the media circles and in the elite business circles, and you go to Los Angeles and you go to Hollywood and you go to where our movies and our television programs are primarily made, and you'll discover that amongst the people who are now identified by that term, the cultural creatives, you'll discover they are similarly secularized. So when we talk about America If we're talking from a relatively small town in Texas, or from a county seat in Alabama, or from a village in Wisconsin, we're going to be telling a different story than if we're in Hollywood, or in Manhattan, or in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or in Berkeley, California. But the reality is that those spaces are not equal in terms of cultural impact. Birmingham is not the center of our film industry. Lindale, Texas is not the center of our media. Instead, they are in these secularized places where the people who attend the most secularized schools end up in the most secularized roles in the most secularized regions, and they produce what the rest of us read and write and watch. And for that reason, they have inordinate influence. One of the high priests in the 20th century of secularization theory is a man who's taught for many years at Boston University. His name is Peter Berger. He is one of the most influential and authoritative religious sociologists. And he is a man who, in terms of secularization theory, has been one of its major proponents and is now one of its major critics. He is an intellectually honest man when it comes to the failures of his own theory, and he has come back to speak about secularization falsified. He said, those of us who in the middle of the 20th century were sure that there's this inexorable, unstoppable march into a fully secular future were wrong, except where we were right. We were wrong about Birmingham, and we were wrong about Dallas, and we were wrong about Peoria, but we weren't wrong about Berkeley, and we weren't wrong about Cambridge or Manhattan or Hollywood, and we weren't wrong about Europe. Berger, in speaking about this, gave an illustration. It's one of my favorites, and it will be one of yours too. He was a participant in one of these massive studies of religious identification that went global. And there was no particular concern whether one was a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Jainist or a Christian or a Jew. Just, do you believe in God? And are you religious? And do you do the things that the people of your faith would do? Or are you active? And they discovered that the most secular nation on earth by that kind of study was Sweden. Turned out that almost nobody goes to church. Almost nobody has any guilt over no longer believing in God. And you take it on down from family definition and marriage law and all the rest, it's just virtually, totally, utterly secularized. Now, you probably would not be surprised to know that the nation on earth that by this sociological definition was most religious was India and the Asian subcontinent. Speaking of America, this is the part you're going to love. Berger said, America is a nation of Indians ruled over by an elite of Swedes. And he said, so if you're looking at America and you look at its population writ large, it's second only to India. But if you look at the elites, they're second only to Sweden. There we are. And there's our mission field. There's our neighborhood. This is our culture. I said we would have to use another word. After secularization, we've got to talk about secularism. Secularization is a theory about a process. It's an argument about whether something's going to happen or not, and it's being made by people who at least present themselves as value neutral on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And so we all have to talk about secularization. Christian theologians have to talk about secularization. Missiologists and pastors and intellectually minded Christians have to think about secularization. And so do atheists and those who would push and seek to champion this kind of secular progress. But secularism isn't an argument. It's a movement. It's an ideology. It is not value neutral. It suggests that the future will only be positive if it is an utterly secular future. Now, secularism also has a deep grounding now in American culture. And just to illustrate this, given the time, I want to make reference to the fact that there is now the rise of this new atheism. I wrote a book on this entitled Atheism Remix, in which I sought to explain why there is something that would be called the new atheism. And the background of that is absolutely fascinating. The English language didn't even have a word for atheist until the Elizabethan era. It didn't need it. There was no need for a word to describe someone who utterly did not believe in God. And the question up to that point was, in which God do you believe? Miles Coverdale, actually, the Oxford English Dictionary, credits with coining the word atheist. Talking about the 16th century. There have been atheists, certainly, from the 16th century onward, who were rather self-consciously those who denied the existence of God. But it's really interesting when you look backwards, you were a particular kind of atheist. You were a Christian atheist, or you were a Jewish atheist like Spinoza, or you were some kind of atheist. You had once been something, but then you became a disbeliever, now you're a denier, and you generalize that to atheism. And there have been atheists that have been a part of global culture for at least most of the 20th century. You had rather famous atheists, the British philosopher Bertrand Russell, for instance, or the activists in the United States, Madeleine Murray O'Hair. But, their atheism was just considered kind of a part of their personality. It wasn't that it was a major driving intellectual force that had a contagion to it. It was rather that this was an interesting part of and Madeleine Murray O'Hair was like a publicity stunt. But nonetheless, she certainly gave some visibility to the presence of atheists. But the new atheists are quite different. Talking about figures such as Richard Dawkins, the Charles Simonyi Chair, the professor of the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford University, one of the world's most influential evolutionists, probably the singularly most influential evolutionary scientist in America, in the world today. Daniel Dennett, who is a professor of psychology at Tufts University, also a major evolutionary figure. Sam Harris, now rather freelancing as one of the major new atheist figures, but is formerly associated with Stanford University. And Christopher Hitchens, the British literary figure, who has been known for some time as an ardent atheist and now has joined Dawkins and Dennett and Harris, and these four together constitute the four horsemen of the new atheism. Now, in my book, Atheism Remix, I suggest 7 reasons why the new atheism is genuinely new. And the first is that it represents an unprecedented new boldness. And this boldness is indicated by their public relations strategy, by their media strategy, by the strategy they have to reach the schools, by the strategy they have to reach the public. The strategy of this movement is represented by the fact that their books are bestsellers, and they're bestsellers with traction. They're bestsellers that spawn other bestsellers. They have developed a bold new momentum for the argument of atheism. The second distinction is their clear and specific rejection of the God of the Bible. Now, this is crucial for our understanding of where we stand right now over against the new atheism. The new atheists, as distinct and contrasted to the older generation of atheists, have centered in on the God of the Bible as the only God worth denying. It's very interesting. It's a strange compliment to pay to the God of the Bible, that he's the only God actually worth denying, because he's the only God with cultural relevance in the West. It is the God with whom they have to do. And it is a very straightforward and specific rejection of the God of the Bible that is centered in 3 things. And very quickly, I'm just going to say they are science and reason and morality. What makes this new argument very interesting is their specific rejection of the God of the Bible as an immoral figure, as a figure of intellectual contempt. They are moving from the argument that it is not intellectually necessary to believe in God to the argument that it is criminally wrong to believe in this God. The third distinction is their clear rejection of Jesus Christ. The older atheists tried to stay away from Jesus, or at least to argue the kind of argument you find summarized in the works of C.S. Lewis, that there was the argument, has been the argument that he was an enlightened man, a good man, a teacher. Lewis spoke of the intellectual indefensibility of that proposition, but nonetheless it was popular, and most of the atheists, even the atheists of the 20th century, stayed away from Jesus. That is not true of these 4. They specifically reject Jesus, also on moral grounds. Christopher Hitchens, for instance, says, speaking of the old liberals, and in particular of liberal theologians, he says, what in the world did they do, making this distinction between the evil, mad, judgmental God of the Old Testament and the supposed tolerant, sweet Jesus of the New Testament? He said, have they read the book of Revelation? Jesus turns up pretty intolerant in the book of Revelation. And as Hitchens says, he's just as bloodthirsty as his father. Thus, he must be rejected as well. Fourth, a clear claim to scientific argument. The new atheists, to an individual, especially Dennett and Dawkins and Harris, center their argument in scientific reason. It is unthinkable. It is no longer merely that it is unnecessary that one believe in God. It is unthinkable, because if one believes in God, one must reject the most obvious knowledge that is accessible to us as the gift of modern science, which is the entire worldview of evolution and all that goes with it. Fifth, there is a refusal to accept moderate forms of belief. This one's actually fun to watch. The secularists in the 20th century were convinced that liberal theologians were their friends because they recognized what was going on. Liberal theology is just a way of moving into atheism without acknowledging that's what you're doing. And the atheists said, hey, we got time. You'll move our way. That led to some of the most famous encounters, and I just love this. As a theologian, I just love this. I love Sidney Hook, an atheist, reviewing Paul Tillich, a liberal theologian, who reviewed one of his books saying, I'm an atheist, Paul Tillich is an atheist. The difference is, I know I'm an atheist. He doesn't yet know he's an atheist. Absolutely true. Eugene Genovese, writing a review, again, of liberal theologians, said, hey, it takes one to know one. I used to be an atheist, and this is what atheists look like. The new atheists reject this. Sam Harris is really leading the edge on this. He keeps going and saying, look, what we're doing when we say that liberal theologians, that still claim they still meet in churches with steeples and some of their pipe organs and all the rest, when we think they're our friends, we need to reverse that. They are the cultural enablers of the real believers. They're giving cover to the real believers. I'll just tell you this. I've never thought of liberal theology as a cultural cover. I'll just tell you right up front. But to Sam Harris, that's what it looks like, because he's aggravated by the fact that every time I show up on television, there is some, or any other conservative evangelical Christian shows up on television, there's going to be some liberal theologian they put on with us to say, yeah, but they're Christians who don't believe that. And Harris is saying, yeah, but they're not Christians. Which is true. I'm aggravated because the liberals trying to say this is Christianity, but so is Sam Harris. He said, look, he's given that fundamentalist cover. 6, there's an assault on toleration. Again, this is led by Sam Harris, suggesting that religious toleration is something we now can't afford. You think about that argument being made in 21st century America, in the United States of America, that religious toleration, that religious liberty is something we now cannot afford, and you think, well, that would be a marginal argument. The man has written one bestseller, followed by a second bestseller, followed in just a few weeks by a third bestseller. His newest book, by the way, is going to be on ethics after God and the superiority of an atheist secular ethic to the Christian ethic. The last thing, and this ought to send a chill down your spine and must be said because I want you to hear it. One of the hallmarks of the new atheism, the last one I will mention here, is their intellectual argument. Well, let me back up a minute. You remember I said one of the assumptions of the secularization theorists was that belief in God was an inherited belief? Well, the seventh hallmark I identify in my book of the new atheists is that they want to identify the catechizing of children as child abuse. And Richard Dawkins has gone so far as to seek to actually have this made into a process of legislation in Western Europe, in his case in the United Kingdom. Hasn't gone too far yet, but let me tell you, that sword is ready and just waiting for the legal and legislative opportunity. Now, are atheists gaining ground? Clear question. I mean, are they winning? Well, you look at the statistics, and even the stuff that Newsweek felt was important enough for a cover story says they're not winning. I mean, you reduce the Christian identification from 86 to 76, and that's a 10% loss. You increase them from 9 to, say, 20%, and you got something, and by the way, that figure's inflated, but still, they got growth, but we're larger than they are. If this is a battle of numbers, we show up with 76%, they show up with 14%, we win. That's not the way it works. Not the way it works at all. Richard Dawkins doesn't really care what people in Birmingham think. Daniel Dennett's not really concerned with turning Southern Baptists in Dallas into atheists. Sam Harris isn't worried about turning the PCA into an atheist denomination. because they're certain we're simply going to die out. They want our children. And they figure that when we send our children to college and university, they have them. They figure that when our children move to the cities, they have them. They figure that when our children go to Hollywood and watch Hollywood's products and read their products, they have them. They want to reach the elites. And at the level of the elites and those who are aspirational elites, that means our children, they want to make theism unthinkable. That's the goal of the new atheist. The goal of the new atheist is not really the goal that somebody, who's a fervent believing Christian is going to pick up one of their books and become an atheist. Their public relations strategy, their intellectual strategy is to make theism unthinkable for the people who will be in the elites, who will be the culture shapers, who will be those who aspire, who are the students who come to study with the professors, who are the interns who come to work with the producers. What's really going on? Well, I think the greatest analysis comes from a Canadian philosopher by the name of Charles Taylor. And it is worth our while to consider what he discusses in terms of 3 different sets of conditions of belief. This is Saturday. I'm so impressed that there are Christians who would show up for a talk like this on a Saturday. This is a workout. Just follow with me. Charles Taylor says that in the West, in Western cultures, we've gone through 3 successive conditions of belief. 3 operational sets of conditions of belief. And that may sound like a huge intellectual term that doesn't have any direct relevance, but when I explain it for just a moment, I think you'll see and sense why it's so important. He says, for most of the history of the West, it was impossible not to believe. There was no alternative reality. There was no alternative explanation to how human beings came to be. There was no other explanation for how the world was created or how it came to exist. There was no other explanation for why one nation fell and another rose. There was no explanation for why the sun rose and the sun set, other than that God, had created this and was in control of this and ruled over this and showed himself in this. There was no intellectual alternative to theism for most of Western history. That's why you didn't need the word atheist until the 16th century. As Charles Taylor said, most of our ancestors never considered the fact that there might not be a God. It wasn't an available belief. But he said there then came in the wake of the Enlightenment a second set of conditions. If the first set of conditions was that it's impossible not to believe, the second set of conditions is that it is now possible not to believe. So now it's a choice. It's a choice. You believe in God or you don't believe in God, but it's a matter of intellectual decision and conviction and analysis and belief and choice. It is now possible that you can be a believing Christian, that you can be a fully committed theist, that you can have a theistic worldview and a theistic understanding from a doctrine of creation all the way to eschatology. You can have a Christian understanding of humanity. You can have a Christian understanding of sin, a Christian understanding of redemption, a Christian understanding of providence and history, and you can operate within that world. But you can also have an atheist understanding. It's a choice now. The Enlightenment, with the rise of science, with Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, Darwin, provides an alternative reality, so you actually can now operate in society not believing in God, not believing in creation, not believing in the fall, not believing in sin, not believing in Christ, not believing in redemption, not believing in the consummation of all things by God to his glory. Charles Taylor said from the Enlightenment roughly until the end of the 20th century, that was the operational set of conditions. But he said we have now entered a phase of a third condition of belief, and that is impossible to believe. Now, just like Peter Berger, he would say it isn't true of all places everywhere. It isn't true of all sectors of society simultaneously. But almost exactly like Berger, he would say it's true if you are where secularization has run its course. It is true if you are where the intellectual elites gather. It is true if you are where the cultural creatives are congregated. And that, Charles Taylor says, means the future. And even now, we've shifted into a set of conditions of belief where it's now impossible to believe. Theism is now, amongst the elites and the fully secularized, simply unthinkable. And that, by the way, is what the new atheists want. They want for God as a thought to be unthinkable. And you follow all this, and there's so much more I would wish to say. Peter Berger, by the way, in revising his secularization theory, says something we really need to consider. Evangelical Christians, those of us who are here because we love Christ and we love Christ's church and we're committed to biblical truth. Peter Berger says the biggest problem for most American Christians is not atheism, but what he calls cognitive contamination. Write that down. Cognitive contamination. He says the problem for most American Christians is that their worldview is actually being contaminated by radically unchristian ideas and principles and intuitions, and they don't know it. So they're actually being secularized in a way that is imperceptible to themselves and invisible. They're not deciding to become atheists. They're not even aware of the fact that as they take this course in anthropology, or as they watch this movie, read this novel, or have this conversation, and all the rest, that there's cognitive contamination that is coming in, and their Christian worldview is becoming less Christian, even as they identify themselves as Christians. I can't stop without mentioning the work of Christian Smith and his associates. He was at the University of North Carolina, now is at the University of Notre Dame. In 2005, he wrote a book entitled Soul Searchers, writing about the generation of adolescents that were then aged 13 to 18. He's just written a second book with his team entitled Souls in Transition, dealing with these same young people between the ages of 18 and 23. He's working on the third volume, which will track these young people between the ages of 23 and 29. It is, I think, the most compelling analysis of young people in America today. And it is his diagnosis that most of these young people are actually unified in a moralistic, religious worldview that he calls moralistic therapeutic deism. This is where they really are. Most of them, whether they say they're Christians or atheists or somewhere in the muddled middle, actually believe that there is a God of some sort who wants us to be good and to behave, who wants us to feel good about ourselves, that's the therapeutic part, and be healthy, and who isn't very involved in our lives until we might, in some kind of emergency, need him. Now, one of the most frightening things to us should be the fact that these sociologists taking a look at our own young people are discovering that they are not markedly less committed to moralistic therapeutic deism than their more secularized cohorts as adolescents and young adults, which is to say, they're picking it up from our churches. They're picking up moralistic therapeutic deism from our Sunday school classes and our youth groups and from far too many of our pulpits. I can't talk about what it means to address the issue of the disappearance of God and talk about secularization and secularism and the new atheists without doing what I must do and we must do together. And that is to recognize that we have met the enemy. And in far too many cases, it is ourselves. Berger's notion of cognitive contamination, Christian Smith's notion of moralistic therapeutic deism, that should be a bigger concern to us than the new atheists. Because this is about giving away Christianity and moving from theism into atheism while still feeling like you're a Christian and telling people you're a Christian. But let's not leave the new atheists and let's not leave the secularists, because they're right when they think they are the future, because they think they will receive our children. Peter Berger had to come back and rewrite his secularization theory. He had to go back and write Secularization Falsified, where he said, we were wrong, except where we were right. I greatly fear that in just a matter of a few years, there can be another analysis that demonstrates we were more right than we thought. Because the engine for secularization turns out not just to be the secularists, but many who would claim to be Christians and would preach and teach, or would lead and, by example and precept, actually allow and encourage the kind of cognitive contamination that invisibly but substantially moves people out of Christianity into what can only be called atheism. We talk about the disappearance of God. It led Newsweek magazine into quite a controversy. But the controversy was about what the article really didn't even address. The reality is that the disappearance of God is what we note all around us by the fact that most of our neighbors live as if God does not. If the church of the Lord Jesus Christ does not live so obviously by the fact that we believe that He does, then the secularization is our fault. God bless you.